welcome everyone. I would really like to thank you all for being here. And, my name is Ron Watson. I am president of Watson Strategies, but I also have a couple other hats that I wear. I'm also the president of governmental relations for AltMed Enterprises, which is the main sponsor today and is the Move product line. Please stop by and say hello to the booth. And I'm also the executive director of a group called the Florida Society of Cannabis Physicians. And what I'm trying to do is organize the doctors. I want to be the FMA of actually supportive doctors as we move forward. So I wear multiple hats here, and those are some of my disclosures. I am so excited not to see only this room as full as it is, but as I look at the panel that we have and put up here, I'm so excited to actually let them start talking to you, so I'm going to do the best I can to kind of get through this. I'm going to do a brief introduction of our panelists. I'm going to go into how we got to where we are now over the last 4.5 years, and then we're going to open it up to where do you think we go from here, and then hopefully we'll have time at the end for some questions. So again, if I may start my introduction, Gene had asked me not to give the entire bio because that might take a half an hour for each of these individuals. So what he said is that all the bios are online and you can get more information about each of our panelists that way. But I'm going to give just a very brief introduction. We'll start over here on this side. And we have with us Dr. Barry Gordon, MD, who is the Chief Medical Officer for Compassionate Cannabis Clinic of Venice. So welcome. We have a physician on the board here to talk to us about that. Next to him, we have Dr. Jeff Sharkey. He's the managing partner of Capital Life Group Incorporated, and he's executive director of the Medical Marijuana Business Association of Florida, and he's actually been lobbying even longer than I have, so I like to tease him about issue advocacy. I'm sorry. Okay, and then to my immediate right, we have Robert Tonello, who is the president of Three Voice Farms, and he was one of the recent license winners after Senate Bill 8A passed. Moving over here to this side, we are thrilled to have two legislators with us that were very involved in actually crafting this. We have Representative Katie Edwards Walpole, who was just married recently, and she was one of the co-sponsors of the original low THC, or some would call it Charlotte's Web bill. Unbelievable. She has decided, she broke my heart and decided not to seek her fourth term in office, so she will not be seeking re-election, and she was just recently married, but has been an unbelievable advocate for this particular issue moving forward. To her left is Representative Ray Rodriguez. He was the main sponsor of Senate Bill 8A that passed during the 2017 session. From Fort Myers, he's the actual majority leader of the House. As a budget manager for Florida Gulf Coast University, he was first elected in 2012, and again has been very influential in helping shape this industry as we move forward. So we're very honored to have him here as well.
Way to go, Ray!
And then finally, we have Matt Duffy, who is the president of AltMed Enterprises. So again, we wanted on this panel to have some industry perspective, some lobbyist perspective, some physician perspective, and legislator perspective. So I'm excited to get started here. And so again, what I was tasked with doing is basically trying to explain to you how we got to where we are now. And Sharky's already told me that I talk too much, so I'm going to try to get through this quick so then we can actually have the panel talk about where we think we're going. So, real quickly, we're going to go through the low THC bill passing. Then Amendment 2, first time fails. Then nothing basically happened in 15. Then we actually passed the right to try bill, which I'll talk more about. There was a question here in Florida. Then the Amendment 2 actually passed. Then we had a regular session when the bill died. Then we had a special session when we actually passed the bill. And we'll talk a little bit about the Department of Health rules, or lack thereof, and the glitch bill that we had this last session. So how did we start this off? I'm going to thank and blame Representative Edwards for me standing up here right now, because my life changed one day as I sat in the committee meeting, and it was because of her low THC bill. My story, and the reason that I'm so involved in this, is I lost my 8-year-old son to leukemia. So I got a little emotional over here when we talked about being able to help the other child, because God bless you, unfortunately I was on the the wrong side of that. So one day sitting in committee, this bill, low THC bill, is up, and I called them mama bears. There was a mama bear up there testifying about how they've tried everything for her child, and the only two options left are either have her child's brain sawed in half or to try cannabis, low THC cannabis. And the line that killed me was, she said each night before she went to bed, she prayed for God to take her child because the suffering was just too severe for her to watch anymore. I cried. Why? Because the night before my son passed away, I too made that prayer of desperation and said, God, please take my child because the suffering is just too great. So that day in the committee meeting, when I cried, I said, I want to make a difference. If we can just save one parent, just one, from making that prayer of desperation, this is what I want to do. So I went home and told my wife, I got a great idea. I want to quit my well-paying job. I want to start my own firm, and I want to talk about cannabis, and I don't have any clients. What do you think? I'm still standing here 4 years later, so.
Glad to have you.
Yeah.
What happened in 2014 and how did we get started? I'm going to say it was the mama bears, and it was the passion of a mama bear with the sick cub, because that's hard to ignore, but it was also individuals like Representative Edwards here that was smart enough to know how to work the system. She was a co-sponsor of this bill. The other main sponsor was Representative Matt Gaetz. Representative Matt Gaetz and her are about parallel opposites when it comes to most issues. But on this particular issue, they worked like a well-oiled machine, and it was proud. I was proud to see the legislature actually, be bipartisan now and again, because it doesn't happen all the time. But on this particular issue, it happened. So we were lucky enough to pass a bill in 2014 that actually did the following. The qualifying condition was only cancer, seizures, and muscle spasms. It had to be the last option only. You had to have basically tried every other option. The only physicians were MDs and DOs, and they had to take an 8-hour course before they could make any recommendations. It cost $1,000, and it was only offered by the FMA, and I could go on about that for a whole hour. It required a treatment plan that included dose, route of administration, duration, monitoring, and all of that was supposed to go to the UF quarterly. It required a medical director, and it was an MD or a DO. It required an online secure compassionate use registry, which is why we have the registry. It defined low THC as 0.8% or less. And that's interesting because the definition of hemp is 0.3% or less. So our low THC law kind of had a 0.5% like upgrade, so to speak. It did ban smoking, but it allowed vaping, and it was silent on edibles. The way that they decided to do it was they divided the state up into 5 regions, and they were going to award a dispensing organization in each one of those regions, and they required vertical integration. So I'm assuming most people here know the difference between vertical and horizontal. Is that correct? Okay, so I can move on from that. It required vertical integration, and it required you had to be a 30-year nursery as the only eligible applicants. So with that, and you had to have at least 400,000 plants, and that was the idea of trying to tie this into a Florida-specific company. There were only 98 companies eligible when they applied for licenses. They had to do background checks and so forth. So that was 2014, unbelievably emotional session, and thanks to her and others, we were able to actually get it done. Then in November of 2014, the first Amendment 2, because they were both Amendment 2s, actually failed. But strangely enough, it got 57.6% of the vote. And I'll just throw out some numbers here. That was actually 887,000 votes more yes than no. It was actually 500,000 more votes than Governor Scott got, and he won his election. It had only failed to reach it by 141,000 votes. So it was pretty close. It was a good turnout, but hey, it was short. So what happened after that? Basically, in the 2015 session, we tried to get a glitch bill to pass through. The Senate was a little bit more interested in it. The House actually passed the right to try bill that year, but it didn't include cannabis. We'll talk about that in a bit. So basically, nothing passed that year as one of the chambers went home a couple of days early, and it kind of shocked us all. Nonetheless, we had been working on rules. So back in 14, the bill actually passed. We go into 15, there was a set of rules by the Department of Health that was challenged successfully and thrown out. They had a kind of workshop of individuals that came together to do the next set of rules. Those were actually adopted in May of 2015, became effective in June, and in the first first go round, it allowed a 21-day application period for applicants. There were 28 applications filed by 24 different nurseries. There were rules about how they were going to score them in each region. And in the first go round, you only competed with the other companies that were in your region. And that's how you were awarded. So after 3 separate judges scored, these were the winners. And we have a lot of them here today. The Northwest winner was Hackney Nursery, which became True Health. The Northeast winner was Chestnut Hill, which now is Liberty Health Sciences. The Central winner was Knox, and it's Knox Medical. Then we had Alpha Foliage, who became Sotera Therapeutics. We had Costa, who became Modern Health Concepts and is now using Curaleaf. And those were the original 5 winners. You can see on the bottom there were 2 more added through lawsuits, and we'll talk about them in a minute. And that was San Felicio Nursery and Mercori Sunny Hill Nursery, which have become the Green Solution and Grow Healthy. All right, so after that, we know in the beginning of 2016, the Second Amendment 2 actually made the ballot. So as the beginning of 2016 session begins, one of the ideas was to try to add cannabis to the right to try bill that had passed before. And the right to try bill basically said if you're dying within a year, you can have access to a, quote, unproven drug by the FDA as long as it's gone through a stage 1 clinical trial. So actually in 15, they attempted to put cannabis in there. We were not successful. But in 2016, we actually added cannabis to the right to try law. Basically, if you're dying within a year, why not, right? That was kind of the theory behind it. But the other thing that happened that year is there was a glitch bill. So we kind of had a glitch bill going separately from the right to try bill, and we kind of combined them together. So a lot of how we got to where we are was in that bill as well. So in the 2016 session, it was still non-smoking, but it clearly allowed vaporizing at this point. There was a new 45-day supply limit, but the physician orders were good for a year. This is where we had the 90-day requirement, that we had to have at least 3 months of an existing physician relationship to try to make sure that these people weren't just doctor shopping. It required 2 physicians for right to try determinations. It removed the permanent resident requirement. There's a lot of stuff on here, seed to sale, retail store hours. Now, this was interesting because what it did was the first 5 winners could not start because there were lawsuits going on. And if it was me or you and I'm suing you, then you can't start until that lawsuit is over. So one of the big things that was in this bill basically said that the first 5 winners were allowed to move forward regardless of ongoing lawsuits. So it really kind of started and got off the ground at that point. It added 3 new licenses, but the trigger at that point was going to be 250,000 patients. And it did allow some wholesale purchase between the organizations, kind of relaxing the vertical just a wee bit. So there's other stuff in there. It had pesticides, it lowered the bond. This is interesting. It preempted, again in vertical, you have growing, processing, and retail. It preempted to the state the growing and processing locations on where they're allowed to be, but it did allow the locals to decide retail locations. Some other things in there, you know, prohibiting use in public, testing, labeling, security, and so forth. So that bill passes. We go later into that year, and now the Second Amendment 2 passed this time. And this time it passed by 71.3%. It truly was a bipartisan victory across the state. There's some numbers here. Fascinating to me. 120 state House districts, 40 Senate districts, and 27 congressional districts. And I did the math, and I broke it down. That's 187 ways we divide the state of Florida up. Do you know that only 2 of 186 districts didn't make 60%? Now, maybe problematic is one of those districts is the incoming speaker. But nonetheless, if you look at some of the other districts, we had a high of 81.5%, and literally the lowest district in the state of Florida was 57.6. It was truly an amazing vote. Rural, urban, you know, conservative, liberal, it was amazing. So, here's some differences. The First Amendment that failed versus the Second Amendment 2 that passed. They made some changes. They clarified that it had to be a debilitating medical condition. They also clarified that other conditions must also be of the same kind or class. It added PTSD and epilepsy specifically as conditions, but strangely enough, it removed Hep C. And it did some other things because of the existing law. So there were some differences between the amendments. Okay, so amendment passed. We have an existing law. What are the differences? If you look at Amendment 2, what it says is that the legislature can do anything that's, quote, consistent with what the amendment says. So then the argument became, what's consistent and what's not consistent with the existing law that we had? And the department only had 6 months and 9 months to get some of this done. They led off with some rules that weren't my favorite, one being that there was going to be a second list and only a second list of conditions would be allowed. And thankfully we talked about that. So what were the differences between the existing law and what the constitutional amendment said? Well, here's some of the possibilities, and this is what the legislature had to debate as they move forward. Vertical versus horizontal, registration versus licensure. Can we still do the 30-year nursery requirement? Should it be a free open market or should it be controlled? Smoking versus non-smoking. Who gets to decide the conditions? ID cards versus the registry. Residency requirements. A 3-month relationship. And there were all of these different questions as to, now that we have an amendment sitting up here and a law here, what are they to do? So we came into the regular session in 2017. And in the Senate, there were actually 6 different bills. 5 of them were vertical and only 1 was horizontal. I think they pretty quickly decided that they were going to try to continue the vertical system. So Senator Bradley was the lead sponsor in the Senate, and Representative Rodriguez was the main sponsor in the House. And I had told him that I was going to say this. His bill started out as being very, very restrictive. But as both bills moved through the process, as tends to happen, they started kind of coalescing on certain issues. So what both chambers seemingly had agreed to was to remove the 90-day requirement, to continue the ban on smoking, but allowing vaping and edibles with restrictions. They agreed to add 10 more licenses, but kind of how and whom and when weren't decided yet. Remove the 30-year nursery. They were going to allow snowbirds to be eligible. And they, instead of the 45-day supply limit, now we're going to have a 70-day supply that in theory can be refilled 2 more times before you have to go back to see the physician for basically what I'll say the 4th refill. They required independent, they were going to require independent lab testing, grandfathered in the existing license and patients. But there were some problems, and I won't get into that. The issues that actually, in my opinion, caused the bill to die that session was how are we going to cap retail establishments? The Senate wanted to limit, the House didn't. The House started off with a number and then went up. The Senate started off with a number and then went down. So that's not generally how you come together on issues. So that was very problematic, and that was an issue that really was probably why it died. And then also the specifics of the next 10. Who gets them? How are they in line? How are we going to handle that? And then frankly, a sales tax versus no sales tax. The Senate wanted to tax it, and the House didn't. So the bill died. Oh my gosh, where do we stand now? We have a constitutional amendment, we have a law in place, we had an implementing bill that didn't make it to the finish line. There was a little bit of confusion, let's just say. Thankfully, we actually had to come back in a special session. It was mainly for the budget, but we were able to convince leadership to actually add this issue back in. So, real quickly, I'm going to go through what happened and why we have the law we do now. Again, so Senate Bill 8A passed during a summer special session. Basically what it did is expand on the law we already had in place. And it became effective June 23rd because the day the governor signed the bill, they put in there it's effective upon becoming law. So it became effective pretty quickly. It still required the Department of Health to promulgate a whole lot of rules. It required the Board of Medicine and Osteopathic Medicine to do a consent form and other things, and they've done their job. It did end up exempting it from sales tax. And I was kind of torn on this because I don't think you tax medicine, and I think this medicine will be expensive for the patient, so I kind of leaned on it that way. But at the same time, you want to maybe have some revenue for the state so then they're able to. So that was kind of an up in the air kind of jump ball. It established how qualified physicians do their certifications for their different conditions. And these are the conditions specifically listed in the bill that were also in the constitutional amendment: cancer, epilepsy, glaucoma, HIV/AIDS, PTSD, ALS, Crohn's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and this is the or other debilitating medical conditions of the same kind or class as comparable to those enumerated. Now, interestingly enough, they didn't include a definition of chronic non-malignant pain, but I've always been confused by this because it's tied to the underlying condition. And so if you have an underlying condition that qualifies you, you're really not being qualified for the chronic pain. And so I think we need to address that issue moving forward because there's some doctors who are confused about whether they can just do it for pain or do they have to then send in the justification for pain if it's not tied to an underlying condition. So that's something I hope we can work on. And it required a terminal condition still. It takes 2 physicians for that. It eliminated the 90-day wait period, yes, that was a big victory. And so, allows edibles and vaping, but they prohibited smoking, but they allowed flower to be sold in a sealed, tamper-proof receptacle for vaping. Because the argument is, if you're allowed to legally vape and you can vape oil or flower, should you be allowed to vape flower? And so that's kind of how that issue was handled. Registry and ID card, grandfathering the existing patients, the 2-hour course now instead of an 8-hour course by the docs. And this was an issue too, because what the law said was 90 days after the course is available, if you haven't taken it physician, you're no longer a treating physician. So we lost about 400 doctors when that 90-day period hit, because they either didn't know they needed to take the new course, or for whatever reason they just didn't. And that was an issue because only the physician can take a patient off of their list. So if now 400 doctors came off the registry overnight, it was problematic. But I'll give the Department of Health credit for working with us and trying on a case-by-case basis to solve that as we move forward. Prohibits a qualified physician from having any direct or indirect economic interest in any MMTC, which I think is a good thing. And it required no more than 3 70-day supply limits, which we've talked about. And it requires you to basically go back at the 210 days to see your doctor, but your doctor can ask you to come back prior to that if he or she wants. Some other stuff, it prohibited telemedicine. I was kind of trying to say, I understand maybe the first visit needs to be face-to-face, but I was encouraging maybe, the follow-ups could be, telemedicine, especially if you're really, really ill, so I'm going to continue to work on that. This was interesting. So if it is the other condition that I talked about, the doc gets to make that call, but he or she must justify it to the board of medicine within 14 days. So it's not like you're asking permission, you're just justifying your decision. And so unfortunately right now that's still being snail mailed in. They're supposed to fix the registry where all of that can be electronic. So hopefully in the future that will be a little more quickly and seamless too. Let's see, pregnancy was an issue. We ended up deciding that if you're pregnant, you can't take full strength, but that you are authorized to take low THC cannabis. And so that was an interesting issue that was debated as well. Uniform consent document that they've done. This was interesting. Somebody talked about Senate Bill or House Bill 21. The only mandatory review of the prescription drug monitoring program in the state of Florida were for cannabis physicians. So you could write a script for Oxy all day long and not have to check the database. But if you did one for cannabis, you had to check the database. So thankfully in House Bill 21, which just passed, which the gentleman mentioned earlier, it actually requires a physician now to look at the PDMP before they're allowed to write a narcotic, which I thought was a wonderful addition to that bill. Updates are required in 7 days. The existing 7 licensees were just grandfathered in and they were allowed to be MMTCs. The compromise was, okay, we're gonna limit the retail stores for each MMTC, but it's gonna be 25 and that's gonna be statewide. But over and above that, they said there's gonna be a regional cap too, based on population. We're still waiting for the Department of Health to do that regional cap number. The other thing, what it said was, okay, we're gonna license 10 new MMTCs. The thought was, hey, let's get some out right away so more competition will be out there. So the decision was made for individuals who had applied years before and lost, that they should have shot at the first 5. And so that's what ended up happening. Plants of Ruskin was awarded one of those 5, and AltMed Florida, my company with Move, that's the provider there. Three Boys Farms, which is right up here as well, was also one of the winners. Loops was a winner, and now they are going to be called Vitacan. Sunbolt was a winner, and they're going to be called Better Grow. Treadwell was a winner, and they're going to be called Remedy. So there was one more court case that was actually awarded in the process, and that was Keith St. Germain, and I don't know if they have a name or not yet. So then we basically had 4 licenses left at that point of the 10. And so we're still been fighting with the Department of Health over those rules and how they're going to score them and how they're going to actually take the new applicants. But of the 4 remaining licenses, one is supposed to go to a black farmer, and that's a long story about they were not eligible to be a 30-year nursery because they've been discriminated against, yada, yada, yada. And so this was a way to try to remedy that. So there will be 1 licensee going to a black farmer applicant. They decided that 2 of those should get what's called a citrus facility rehab preference. So you get some bonus points if you're going to rehab a citrus facility that's been sitting around not doing well. And then there basically was 1, what I'll call free and clear license, still up for grabs. However, at 100,000 patients, they're going to add more MMTCs and they're going to add more actual retail stores. And we are right there at 100,000. 100,000. We actually have like 115,000 in the registry right now, and about 95,000 in the registry with an ID card. And it's been interpreted that that's the number. The ID card number is the trigger for 100,000. So literally, in the next week or two, that 100,000 number will most likely be triggered, which then means those new licenses are available, most likely for the same people applying for the 4 left. And it's been interesting to see how that's kind of worked its way out. The Board of Medicine created a physician certification pattern review panel, and they're going to review and track all physician certificates by physician in the aggregate. And that's interesting because we're going to be studying that information. I'm going to try to get here to the end quick. Monitor physician certification, and then the coalition. There's penalties. Oh, don't get me started on this, and I want to talk to you about this later. We put $5 million in the budget for an education campaign, and I was actually supportive of that until I saw the commercial where it talked about get baked, get busted. And that's $5 million going to that. And that to me was an anti-recreational commercial where I think they had an opportunity to try to talk about medicine and how it could affect your ability to drive, and I think it could have been a little more medicinally oriented, but anyhow, we'll talk about that later. There was some money in there for law enforcement training. This is an interesting one. It also created a supplemental licensure fee, and this is one of the few rules the department has gotten around to doing. And basically it was supposed to pay for that public education campaign and the Lee Moffitt research. You know what that fee is? $175,000 per year. Needless to say, I have a feeling that rule may be challenged. It's a little exorbitant, and if that money's going to go for a Get Baked and Drive campaign, anyhow, okay, so school board stuff, seed sale tracking, this is interesting. A daily dose limit, and this is one that's probably going to affect the docs more than almost anybody else. So what it says is you can have a 70-day supply, right? Well, how do you calculate the 70-day supply? The legislature said, let's do a daily dose limit. So you take that daily dose limit and times it by 70, and that's what you're allowed to have. It's problematic because depending upon route of administration, that number can be greatly different. And so I've put 4 doctors in a room and asked them, what do you think that the highest level should be? And I almost started a fight. We almost had a fight in here earlier about that. The dosing and the highest recommendation is interesting. Because what I'm saying is, this one, there is a process where if you want to go over that as a physician, you can get a request to the department. But this is asking permission. So if you set that daily dose limit too low, you're now creating hundreds, if not thousands, of requests to go over that limit. And now the Department of Health is going to have to create a system where there's due process to say yay or nay. So what I'm cautioning them on is you better set that daily dose high enough, because if not, you're going to be inundated with requests, and then you're going to have a whole other system to figure out how to say yay and nay. There's stuff in there on the 30 and 50 and 70-day supplies, yada yada. So the bill passes. We have a law now. The Department of Health still has a whole lot of rules they're supposed to do. So the legislature says, we're going to give you an emergency rulemaking process, which is it's a way to expedite it, let's just say. For whatever reason, we still don't have those rules. They put some out there, they withdrew them. And so, interestingly enough, let's just say the legislature wasn't real happy with the Department of Health, nor are they still, I don't believe. So we come to the 2018 session as we're still fighting over all these rules. And basically, there was a glitch bill that I'll say fixed a black farmer glitch. But also, interestingly enough, and I really didn't think this was going to pass, but darn if they didn't pass it. The legislature, and this was a House idea, they actually withheld $2 million from the Department of Health's salary and budget until all rules are completed. And I wondered if the governor would veto that or not, and he didn't. Now, lo and behold, almost immediately, we got a whole bunch of rule notices. So I think that shot across the bow might have worked there, sir. So these are some of the rules we're still waiting on. What the law says is you can't do any edibles until the rules are in place. We don't have any rules yet. So they did an announcement on edible rules. The dosing, which we just talked about. Lab testing and certificates. There's going to be a whole other industry where they actually license independent labs that have to do all the testing. We're waiting for that. Pesticide use. And then you can look at all these different rules we're still waiting on. And I wake up every morning at 5:30 checking my darn email to see what rules they may have actually proposed today. And each morning I'm generally a little disappointed. So, with all that said, where do we go now? to the group here, and maybe I'd like to start.
One slide, just one slide.
Go back? Okay. And again, you'll be getting all of these sent to you, so unless you have a pop quiz tomorrow, you can get them like next week. Is that enough? All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, where do we go from here? I'm going to try to take questions in a little bit, if you don't mind. And I'd like to have the panel kind of think, where are we going to go? Is there going to be a glitch bill in 2019? Would you like to start?
Thanks, Ron. I appreciate that. Just to start very quickly, I want to introduce two people who we would not be here without their involvement very early on, and that's Bob and Kathy Jordan. And also, too, wanted to recognize, very happy to see Dr. Sue Sisley. I really appreciate all of your work. Thing right now, number one, is getting through the challenges, right? So if you follow what's been happening from a challenge perspective of those initial 10 licenses that were supposed to be awarded, you have Nature's Way, that challenge pending, which I believe will be resolved here very soon, and that will probably result in Nature's Way receiving a license which would allow them to go forth and cultivate just as the others have. And then from there, you've got the Black Farmer license. We've resolved that issue, that challenge through legislation. And then the other two, which are interesting to watch, is this citrus preference. And personally, I think that'll be stricken down, rightfully so. I think that that language was done specifically to benefit one entity, and I think that the courts will see right through that, which leads us back to more than likely a glitch bill for next session. But what comes from that is the implementation end, and that's where the patients and the caretakers and those who are dealing with this day in and day out, when we talk about the dosing, we talk about patient access. I think for those lawmakers, you're going to have a tremendous amount of new faces and people who will be out there knocking on doors and hearing from constituents, and part of it will include a conversation about how well we're doing with the implementation side of it. And I think that all stems from patient access, and what Ron alluded to earlier was the patient education through these campaigns. When we're talking about patient access, one thing to note is the role of local governments. We give them the ability to regulate the dispensing or retail end of it, and they have to do it in such a way as they would with a pharmacy. When you see local governments with moratoriums or bans, and they're not being welcoming or taking the chance to go and visit other sites that are already functional, operational, you have to wonder, does that further restrict patient access? And I would argue that that does. And I think that it really behooves lawmakers to look within their own districts, the patient populations, especially those that hail from rural areas where you may be a licensed provider and say, you know what, it doesn't justify me going into rural areas where I have people with the same types of conditions, underlying health needs, I have veterans. I don't want to force my patients and my constituents to drive to either coast to get something that they're legally entitled to as well, which leads us to looking at alternate abilities to provide them with access to telemedicine for those follow-up visits and be able to ask questions, looking at the role of licensed nurse practitioners. The past few sessions, you see the legislature very intent on focusing on scope of practice issues for healthcare delivery. And we have to look at the way that cannabis fits into that mold as well when it comes to scope of practice and patient access. Another issue too that has been brought up are looking at, again, things that seemingly would not be something that reaches the forefront of deliberations in a committee meeting, but a good example that Ron mentioned was pregnancy. And I'll tell you how that came up. I have a sibling that has a form of epilepsy who thankfully has had 3 healthy children. One of my biggest concerns for her since we were children, and she's a fantastic mom, most of you have seen the pictures of us all together on Facebook, is how would she be able to get through a pregnancy? What would be the impact on her child? And so being able to use a low THC product that's under the supervision of her physician to reduce those likelihood of seizures for me was really important. And talking through those issues, we were able to resolve that. And I think that pregnant women and those that have epilepsy benefit from just that. So having that practical and pragmatic approach to all of those things, to be able to issue spot and have the focus on, we making it that much easier for patients to get access? Are we making sure that patients don't have to go to quack physicians and pay a lot of money and then have issues like the Tampa Bay Times bringing up to us that we've got a real problem with doctors and the amount that they're charging patients? Are they actually being registered in the system appropriately? So we'll have to go back and look at all of those things, and they're appropriate and right for discussion. So I think the next step, besides the challenges, is focusing on the patient access piece.
Doc, would you like to share with us from the medical side where you think
thanks,
we should go?
Thank you very much. And Representative Rodriguez and Representative Walpole, thank you so much for what you did in the past sessions. And as a provider, what I can tell you is that the system that we have right now, albeit a halting system and quite difficult for many to navigate, both patients and physicians, is that it's working. And I want to give a big shout out to my MMTC partners, of course, who are out there providing the medications that we, the medical providers in the state, are recommending. I think we have to remember, everybody, that it is a recommendation. It cannot be a prescription, right? That's by federal Schedule I designation. And Representative Rodriguez, I remember very well when you spoke to that in session last year, to the extent of the need for us to set up a highly regulated system in order to keep the federal government kind of off our backs while we develop our own system. So to the extent of understanding why that had to be, I do well understand it. But how I want to end up my opening remarks is this: where do we go from here? I know where we need to go from here. Where we need to go from here is to increase access to every citizen in the state of Florida that wants access to medical cannabis. I can give you a report from the ground. I have over 2,000 patients in the medical cannabis registry, and I'm proud of it. Every single one of them are coming to me with no desire to get high. They want to feel well. It's a matter of wellness. And I think as soon as we appreciate the fact that from the medical aspect of cannabis, we have a remarkable opportunity to impact upon the narcotic overdose crisis. We have a tremendous opportunity to remove big pharma from our lives. But we need to look at the science that's behind medical cannabis and accept the fact that recreational cannabis use is an entirely different discussion. But I say this to you as well. When we appropriately bring in medical cannabis to this state, the educational aspect of it will enhance our ability to keep our teenagers safe and off cannabis. We've seen that in other states. There has not been an increase in recreational use in other states when the medicinal cannabis has come and the education has been appropriate. So I say that the only way that we make advancements, even on the recreational side, is to appropriately educate on the medical side. And what I've seen, and the latest example of that, is the education that we got from that $5 million. It was a recreational scare type of commercial. It had nothing to do with medical use, and advising my patients on how they can safely utilize medical cannabis as every other drug that people are using and driving, be it opiates, be it gabapentin, or alcohol, any of them. So when I saw that campaign, it just pointed out to me that we have a long way to go.
I'm going to build on the comments. Can you hear me in the back? From the previous two speakers. I'll start with where we agree. The $5 million spent on the recreational campaign was not the intent of the bill. In fact, if you go back and look at the bill, the only area where there should have been education directed to recreational were the funds that were given to FAMU for a campaign that they asked us to be included in the bill. Everything else should have been to medical. So we agreed there. Where we have a slight disagreement, though, is the statement that if you look at states that have medical, that's not resulted in higher recreational use. If you look at states that have recreational, they didn't have recreational until after they had medical. Medical is clearly a path that some in the industry who aren't interested in this as medicine are using to get to their own ends. And so our goal as a legislature was to honor the will of the voters who clearly support cannabis for medical conditions, and that was the bill that we passed. When we look at what's going to happen in the future, I will say, I'll take a step back. As Ron put up in the slide there, it was a special session when we were able to get the implementing bill passed. The next session was an early session. So when we began our last session, it was within 6 months of when we had passed the bill. There really wasn't an appetite in either the House or the Senate to go back and address the subject of medical cannabis, given that the bill that we had passed had just been passed and had not been fully implemented. By the time we come back for our next session, it will have been a year and a half. And I think that's an absolutely appropriate amount of time to go back and to address the question of what are the glitches that we've identified in the bill that has been passed, and what should we do to address that? And I've had this conversation with Senator Bradley over the course of the summer, that I've had people in the industry coming to me identifying glitches. I asked him if he was receiving the same information. He said yes. And so I think it's likely that you will see a glitch bill in the next session to address things that were either unintended consequences or things that are resulting differently than we intended. Starting with the confusion over what triggers the additional licenses and the additional dispensary locations. It was our intent that 100,000 on the registry was the trigger. As Ron has eloquently educated you on, the Department of Health has taken the position that it's not just the registry, but the registry and having an ID card. Well, no, that's not our intent. It's the registry. The registry is what is the metric that triggers all of this. And if we have to go clarify that in statute, then we'll do that. What else has been brought to me is that there's a lag, and this has been reported on in the press, between patients on the registry and patients that are having ID cards. When we hit the 100,000 patients on the registry, only 75,000 of them had their ID cards. Now, what the Department of Health has said is that there are people who sign up for the registry and then don't follow through with their ID card. I find that hard to believe, because you have to go and find a doctor that's gone through the training and is certified to make the recommendation. Go see that doctor, pay cash because your insurance doesn't cover that particular visit, and then go and get yourself put on the registry. Who would go through all that trouble and not take the final step of signing up for their ID card? So there's clearly an issue here.
You know what?
But are the patients the ones not doing this?
What's happening is
There's been about a 90-day wait at various times for the cards, Representative, so I would suspect that the differential are those of people that have been put into the registry by the physician in his office, but yet they have not received the actual hard card.
And if that's the case,
that could absolutely account for 25 to 30,000. Absolutely can.
And if that's the case, the bill's still not working as it was designed.
part of your number are people that were registered prior to requiring cards, and some of those people never came back to get their cards. Because remember, we registered people for a period of time before you had any of those rules. So there is a volume that is that way. But I want one comment on the DOH and their ability to put out the cards. It's one of the worst systems I've ever been a part of. I've been a part of it for 2 years. And the pain and suffering from my office to answer the phone calls, I told my girls, we're no longer the DOH answering service. If you, as a patient, have a problem, go to them. But they have been extremely difficult up until about 2 months ago at issuing cards. And that's your problem area.
It was just privatized, and so in all fairness to the department, trust me, I rag on them when it's appropriate. I just had a friend who got their email in 6 days. I had a friend 2 months ago who got their email in 43 days. So they're making progress, and it was
I'm going to agree
outsourced.
with you on that. The DOH has made significant progress in their ability to get the cards out to patients. There is an online paying system. They do download the driver's license. So believe me, I, like you, will pick my shots, but that's not one of them. That is one that they have approved.
It's better, but there's a nebulous zone of people between October of last year and...
Yes.
I'll speak to it from a different angle. I guess my question for you, Representative Rodriguez, because you would be the one to know, who would be impeding necessarily and making the decision that we have to wait exactly for 100,000 people in the registry? Or why would there even be a debate as to whether or not they have cards or not? We're going to get to 100,000. We know that. And we know that it's going to take the new MMTCs a year to a year and a half to gear up. I'm not what we're waiting for. If you're really thinking about the patients in the state and their access, let's get the process going. I understand how rules are written and this and that, but let's make an assumption here. We're going to get to 100,000 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 months ago. So to me, if we're really interested in the patients, I'll say the same thing. It's the same thing to me when it comes to the appeals on the current lawsuits. Where's Kathy and Bob? And of course, John Morgan just, this past Friday, the lawsuit was won for smoking. 10 minutes later, immediate appeal. The Joe Redner case that I am proudly a part of. Joe Redner's my patient. Those are my orders to grow his plants in the registry, everybody. I'm the only doctor in the state to have it, and you know what? I'm proud of it. An immediate appeal. Decisions coming from. Someone has to be pushing back against this system at every stage of patient access and what the people seem to have wanted.
Let's see if we can hear from our industry friends today as to who and where you think we should be going, and maybe some of the bumps that you experienced getting to where we are now. And start with, well, I checked with him. He's okay. Yeah. So if we could go to Robert.
Let me just say this. I was one of the initial legislators involved in this with Matt Gates. We worked with Senator Clemens at that time. One of the first bills I filed as a freshman legislator was the Kathy Jordan Medicinal Cannabis Act, and about 176 pages long. We would beg to get people to come to meetings and talk openly about this. There was a lot of fear and inability to do that. Kathy Jordan, other growers who I'll out of fear of embarrassment, won't name them, but just trying to get people to come and talk to us, to lend some credibility, was very difficult at that time. So I apologize for any of the shortfalls in the bill, but have to say, we didn't get this type of input. We had a lot of Johnny-come-latelys afterwards, and that very first rulemaking workshop that now Congressman Gates and I attended, I looked at them and I said, where the hell were you guys? We were trying to pass legislation and do things right. I would have loved to have this level of input and experience from those who have worked in other states, but quite frankly, we just didn't have it. People looked at this and really at that time thought that it was a joke. Florida has moved very quickly in a very short period of time in a program, and we are still going to have to work through many of these issues. So conversations like this, not just with a soon-to-be former lawmaker and someone who still is going to be very engaged in the process, you need to be inviting more lawmakers here, and especially the agency regulators from both the Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, and the like, because the bottom line is, come November, you're going to have a new governor, possibly a new party affiliation to go along with that, and that really sets the tone for how the agencies go forward and do their job to implement the rules and statutes that we pass. And so that creates another level of uncertainty and influx with respect to where this industry goes. And so there are a lot of factors and things to consider, but nonetheless, this is great feedback. But I have to point out that the feedback has to be consistent and thorough and very concise as we move through this process, because we need to hear all of these types of things. We shouldn't have to find out after the fact, but the expertise that those of you that are coming from experience out of the state, that's what we need to be hearing. And that's what has to happen in the committee process, working through your legislators, working through all the folks on the Health and Human Services Committee and the like. We need to hear this when we're in the drafting phases so we can get it right the first time.
And let me say it, the bill may not be everything that everyone in the audience wants, but look at the Southeast. Florida is the only state that's had the courage to do this. So we need to be very mindful of the fact that we're a pretty conservative state, and I honestly did not believe in my lifetime that I would see this happen. So we have to remember that.
Hi everybody, I'm Robert Tornello on Three Boys Farm. And
all right.
I want to first off thank Ron, Dr. Sharkey, and the rest of the panel for having me up here with them. We pretty much followed each other's careers. Some of us have met for the first time today, but we know of each other. And the one thing that I think all of us really are striving for right now is a patient's bill of rights. We want to see safe access to medicine, and we want to make sure that people like Kathy is never denied her medicine or the way that she decides to use it. Because we can't have people who don't understand or have never walked that walk or been in her shoes or sat in her wheelchair or been the caregiver like her husband Bob has for so many years to understand the pain, the anguish, and the sacrifice that they have made. In addition to, like Ron, who lost a child, all the parents that we talk to on a day-to-day basis. I mean, how could you go home and go to sleep at night and then vote on something that is not for the patients? And our position at the farm is, when we started, both Ron and Jeff here, we started in the beginning when Senate Bill 1030 started. We met through the rules-making committees, and we all sat there and we all discussed with Linda McMullen and Jennifer DeShetter and all the other people who represented the Department of Health at the time, what it is that we saw, what were our goals as a grower, as a vertically integrated producer. Of course, the laws and many of the rules have changed through the course of years, but the primary reason was that, or then what brought me to this was not because I'm an old hippie that wanted to grow cannabis. I refuse to use the word marijuana because it's cannabis, it's medicine. But it was that we, or a group of us, really saw that we could make a difference, the people that we know, the people who we've talked to through the years, to become voices in the industry and also growers and providers that did provide what we said we were going to do. My background, as some of you know, was design, build, high-risk landscape architecture. I built parks on top of skyscrapers in Canada and Europe and in Asia, giant atriums, and I designed lighting and all kinds of plumbing and special systems. So, knowing Florida and being a grower all my life, I started doing a lot of work with the Chinese government for the panda exhibits, doing the National Zoo and others. And our big concern, of course, was what was it that we put in our plants? How do we grow our plants? Because ultimately the pandas were using them for browse and feeding on them in addition to having them in the landscape. Well, oddly enough, as I learned, was there's more laws and rules and liability, God forbid, poisoning a panda than there is poisoning a person. And so as the economy changed, we knew about the big crash. I had 3 years of backlog that disappeared, and I had 28 employees, 22 that were with me over 20 years. So we decided to move into the food industry, and we grew organic produce. I didn't make a dime, but I kept my guys employed, and we kept moving this. And this is during this whole process when 1030 first came through, and then first failure of Amendment 2. But during that process, the thing that I learned and that I've always been discussing with patients groups and other people is the importance that what we put in our product is exactly what you get as an output. That there has to be transparency with growers, including myself. There has to be standards that we all live to, because ultimately we don't want contaminants, pesticides, or anything in medicine. I mean, at a zero tolerance rate. So this is why I teamed up with Dr. Greg Girdman, who's our Chief Scientific Officer, and another person who works internationally, and Dr. Juan Santos Ramos, who's both a neurologist and a PhD, USF Medical. And we joined up mainly because we shared the same vision. How do we do things that's right for the industry? How do we do things that's right ultimately for the patients? And we finally now are licensed, we are growing, and what part of our program is and why it is a slow rollout. It's not so much that vertical integration is what you've just heard it to be, but you have to think it's 5 industries or 5 different separate businesses now all rolled up into one. And the reason we hired Bill Monroe is because he's a logistics expert, ex-military. And we need everything to slowly fit into each other like a gear, and everything has to seamlessly move through. So when you come out and you do a rollout, you also have pens and products and oral sublingual sprays that don't break in the patient's hands. Things that you could literally put in your pocket or sit on, God forbid, and then still use and deliver your pen, because we all make mistakes. We don't want our delivery devices to fail. So all of these things all kind of work together. And then, of course, how do we work with getting our product out there? And then working with Roz McCarthy and other people, we're finding ways to reach our target audience, but most importantly, always remember that patients are first, profits are a second. We need to and keep that in mind, because we, as we're developing our program right now, we're working with scientists and Dr. Sisley and other people that we know from around the world, and Ethan Russo and so on and so forth. I mean, these people are actually giving us access to a a lot of different phenotypes, a lot of different types of plants that are specifically developed for medicine. Some of them are under utility patents, others are not. But the fact is, we're now starting to work our own breeding program here in Florida, so ultimately we can have seed and phenotypes that we can actually even release to the industry with the department's approval to the rest of the industry at large as a wholesaler of plants in addition to just a product. This way we raise the bar, and again, at the end of the day, patients are the winners. And that's really what we're about, what we want to see happen. And, and again, the medical team and the patients to us have been our guiding force. So we're going to try and live up to that. And also the friendship that I developed with Kathy Jordan has helped me keep focus, on that program. So that's about it. Thank you for having us.
All right, Sharky, since you told me I talked too much, we're going to go to Matt. We're going to go to Matt next, since you told me I talked too much. Matt, from your industry perspective as well, what would you like to see change as we move forward?
First of all, thank you for the invitation here, Ron, and everyone. My name is Matt Duffy, and I'm with AltMed in Altman, Florida. And there are a couple of things that I wanted to spend a little bit more time on. Dr. Gordon raised one of them, and that focused on opioid addiction and opioid weaning. I'd be surprised if there was anybody in the room, myself included, whose family or friends weren't touched, maybe very recently even, by the opioid epidemic. It's devastating, it's widespread. The treatments are arcane, the way that they're treated now, both on a regulatory federal level and how to get into programs. Medicines are crude, they're marginally effective. But if you look at some of the literature that's been coming out and been being published over the last several years, it's pretty compelling. If you look, there have been a series of articles and peer-reviewed both papers and editorials in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And starting back in 2014, a group of researchers out of the University of Pennsylvania documented a significant reduction of around 25% of opioid-related deaths in states that had implemented medical marijuana laws, medical cannabis laws. And if you see that followed up even as recently as last month with a couple more publications, again, all rigorously peer-reviewed by JAMA, that showed anywhere from 6 to 10% reduction in the number of pills of opioids dispensed in states immediately following implementation of medical cannabis laws. It's a significant reduction, it's meaningful to patients. But the other thing that happens is if in fact an indication for either opioid weaning or sparing were introduced, it would allow a lot more patients to get into treatment. In past lives, I come out of the biotech and pharmaceutical industry. I've had reasons to deal with companies that are trying to sell the opioid weaning medicines. And there's such such a level of restriction on the way that patients get in. Physicians can only have a certain number of patients that they're treating with these withdrawal agents. And it's incredibly onerous, the paperwork. The patients got to come back very regularly. The drugs, the way they use them are very, very different. They have to hold them in their mouth for 20 to 30 minutes a couple of times a day. And basically a big spitball for 20 or 30 minutes a day to treat your opioid addiction. It's barbaric. If cannabis works for somebody, it's much more accessible. It's possibly more effective in a lot of patients, and so much more easily utilized. Everybody can get off. Every single one at a time or hundreds at a time, will benefit really everything going on in the state, everything from emergency room to just it goes on and on. But there's so much literature on it now. It's well peer reviewed, and it's very compelling that's we think probably a very good way to go in terms of looking at future uses of cannabis in Florida and probably nationally.
And I remind all of my docs, the first thing you learned in medical school was do no harm, right? Was that the first thing you learned in medical school? And if you had two substances, let's just say equally treated pain, and one kills 15 people a day from overdose, and one has never killed anyone in the history of mankind, what is do no harm?
And to dovetail on that a little bit, another patient access issue that we're very focused on is the two routes of delivery method limitation. And it's a real problem. I mean, like I said, I come out of the biotechnology industry, and you look at how you dose these medicines, and whether it's cannabis or whether it's any other medicine, there's very specific dosing. And for in very specific situations. And with the limit of only 2 routes of administration, it makes it very difficult to maintain microdosing, particularly in patients who may need occasionally a macrodose. And if you look at our product line, you'll see we're very focused on making microdosing available, everything from metered dose inhalers to transdermal patches to creams, as well as vapes. But also, for example, a cancer patient coming out of chemotherapy may need at that point in time a macrodose. If you try and do micro and macro, you're already giving a blow past or to the performance of delivery, and you're not serving, and the patient's not being served as well as they could be.
And let me clarify that. That is not in the law, and that's not even in the rule. That's just something the Department of Health did with their software program, and I have brought it up to them ad nauseum, and I keep saying, guys, there's nothing in law, there's nothing in rule that gives you the ability to limit this to 2 routes of administration. Once we get edibles up and running, that would be the 4th route of administration. Your problem is going to get worse at that point. So I want to very clearly clarify that it's nothing the legislature did. It was actually nothing the department even did in rule. I'm not sure if the vendor made that decision, if it's a software issue, but I certainly, if I could fix one thing today, it would be adding all the routes of administration that are possible. We're going to have a daily dose limit. We're going to have a 70-day supply limit. If you're worried about diversion, I don't think that's a problem by allowing other routes of administration. So again, if I could fix one thing today, and it's not the legislature's fault, it's, I guess, the Department of Health or even their contractors' fault. And so again, I would encourage everyone in here to bring that up repeatedly whenever they get a chance. I also want to say one more thing about Leader Rodriguez. He has a true open door policy because I abused it. He met with me more than I have a feeling he wanted to. And he was always very respectful. But I testified one day that I must not be a very good lobbyist because I couldn't convince him to change any damn thing. No, I'm just kidding. But anyhow, I really want to thank Leader Rodriguez for always listening. He literally opened his door repeatedly. And I think it was almost, oh, here he comes again, kind of thing. But he was very respectful, and I really want to thank him for being here today and listening and to everybody's input. So for what it's worth. I guess I got to let Sharky talk now because, I invited him up here.
Thank you, Ron. I have a 45-minute PowerPoint presentation.
It was 30.
30, yeah. My name's Jeff Sharkey. I'm in Tallahassee. We started and run the Medical Marijuana Business Association of Florida to try to be an advocacy group early on in the process, I think echoing what the representatives have mentioned. As you can imagine, in 2014, driven by some really compassionate folks like Kathy Jordan and Charlotte's Webb's folks and folks in Florida with children who were very, very seriously ill, who were passionate about this, to come to a very conservative legislature and have them listen, bipartisan Democrats, Republicans, to begin to put together a bill, very conservative, good approach, but to kind of break through that rhetoric was extremely important. And over the last, as Ron pointed out, with extreme detail, which he always does, which is great. The iterations of legislation.
That's why he wouldn't last.
Yeah, exactly. Have reflected not only the legislators' attempt to try to develop a rational regulatory framework that makes sense, but also the will of the people. I mean, this group right here, and I want to thank the organizers, have done, this is a testimony to a maturing industry. But if you can imagine back in 2014, 2015, there were a lot of different voices in the cannabis space. I mean, a lot of them, and they all went and talked to those people right there, as well as their colleagues. And it was, it's a little confusing. There's a lot of folks who have different interests, different issues. So one of the things that we did as a business association was really bring together stakeholders and to try to facilitate discussions prior to committee meetings. Ron was included, sheriffs were included, interested licensees were included, all the way to the Say No on Drugs people, the alcohol and drug abuse people, because all of them needed a voice in this process. Physicians were included, the FMA was included, FOMA was included, which I think, again, is a testimony because it was a catalyst for saying we're going to try to make a change here for patients. We're going to really try to do something more. It certainly wasn't perfect. It was incremental in 2014, But as the different interests move forward, you could see, again, so you can see our policymakers, the governor's office included, our policymakers really try to look at what was happening in Florida, what was happening from the voices of folks like you, as well as others. The reason the amendment didn't pass in 2014 was it was a very effective say no on drugs campaign. I mean, that is still out there, but that has really matured, tremendously, where the negative rhetoric has gone away. You've got professionals in this space really talking about the science and the clinical approach to it, which, again, our legislators, Representative Broder and others, said, listen, this has really got to be treated like a medicine. It really has to, we have to understand that there are no double-blind trials out there necessarily. How do we move forward safely to something that's got a framework that works, and we can grow this industry? So I know we talked about a lot of stuff, and Ron did a great job. One of the things from the Tallahassee perspective, we hear from a lot of different people, patients, physicians, MMTCs, about where this is going. So here we are. I just want to talk about a couple of macro trends which I think are impacting this. As you well know, this is a big industry, potentially a huge industry. And if you're hitting the same blogs that I am, so there's some forces that are trying to shape this industry a little bit, both from the ground up as well as from the top down. I'm just going to mention a couple of things that I think are part and parcel of what policymakers and you have to think about as we move this forward. All the things mentioned here in terms of patient focus, really, really important. But you've got businesses here trying to get this product out on the street. So there's a couple of things. First of all, it's a very immature industry, and that's part of the function of the legislation. It's part of the function of the regulatory framework. The DOH is probably 9 months behind the curve. Some of it's understandable, some of it's not. I'm not going to go into that. But all of us are trying. We're in Tallahassee. We're trying to work with the Department of Health, give the benefit of the doubt at some level, but also push to get these rules developed to really allow for testing, to allow for physicians to understand what they really need to do, et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully, that will be, as the little impetus that the legislature provided them with some budget incentives or disincentives. I think we'll accomplish those rules probably in early fall. I mean, there's a rule process which is, I won't worry with, it can be held up by people who want to protest, but hopefully, I think everybody wants to get this done. But it is an immature industry. We've got 13 MMTCs, probably 8 more, coming in this late summer, fall. You've got, if each one of them has 25 dispensaries potentially, which is difficult, that could be 500 retail dispensaries statewide by the end of the year. But we got, around, we got 115,000 patients now. You got 1,400 physicians, a lot of which you're not recommending.
Most.
Yeah. And the EDR, the green eye shade folks at the state who do these revenue estimates and sales tax estimates, the economists, probably are targeting 800,000 patients, probable patients, out of a 20 million patients, 20 million population in Florida. That's a big number. But you've got folks like Robert. Right now you've got 13 existing dispensaries. There are some are growing and selling and have retail distribution centers, dispensaries you heard about. Some are in the process of cultivation. Some have their licenses of cultivation, are just delivering, trying to gauge this patient mix. How do I provide access to patients? It is a business. So they're trying to figure out how to most effectively and efficiently meet the needs of patients. So part of the issues when we come to it, some of these will play into, I think, some legislative initiatives that we recommend along with others is this vertical integration issue, which we told about, which I think was put in statute to maintain a chain of control over this product. There's still some concerns about this product leaking out of this regulatory framework. But it means that a person like Robert or Matt has got to be a great cultivator, a great grower, a great extractor, a great processor, and then, like a CVS or an Apple company, run retail distributions over a very big state, huge state. I mean, it's massive. So there's different skill sets, as Robert pointed out, and these gears may or may not come together. That's why you're seeing this differential of these delivery systems, MMTCs, that are evolving. I mean, listen, we've only been really in business really for a year and a half. I mean, it goes back, but patient. So you got this immature business, and it plays to core strengths. And so you've got Robert cannot, under the current law, subcontract with a retail dispensary operation who really knows their business, right? Who really knows how to I mean, to the credit of our MMTCs here, Tara and Julie, I mean, they're doing a great job as well as they can to really get this out. And so, you know, as they evolve and they, expand their capabilities and capacities, you'll see, obviously, better products. So you got that. One of the big things we hear, and I'll keep this one, is when I talk to the Department of Health, some policymakers, right now, if I said to them, in 3 years, how will you know if this program has worked? Whatever your priorities are. Have patients really been helped? And how do you know? If I got Parkinson's or you've got cancer, how do we know at a data level? This is a Representative Grant issue. Is how do I know at a data level that we're making progress? That folks like Robert are developing products that really work. A lot of anecdotal thought. We've heard some today. So this whole information flow between dispensaries who are growing products, physicians who are using them, and patients to report back that information. So I mean, you're very knowledgeable. But a lot of these physicians are going, I got a 2-hour course, I love the concept, but I don't really know what's going to work for Parkinson's. Right? And so to the extent that there's an ability to improve that data flow, so really policymakers can say 3 years ago, we had an impact. And this is the data. Right? Instead of just, talking about that. I think that's a critical issue, and I know the department's really interested, and I think it's something that a number of different organizations, vendors, and others are working on. 2 more things. Research is super important. Often got underfunded. That needs to change because, again, that feeds into this, what clinically works. We work very carefully, closely in the development of a banking option for the state with First Green Bank. Worked for 2 years on that. They are pulled out of the market. There are some vendors here. That is a critical public safety issue, but it's also a customer issue and a dispensary issue. You can't do this with cash, and there's a lot of different debit options. Well, that's something I think, whether or not the legislature can help with that, there may be some things that make the risk profile a little bit easier. 2 more things.
Just more than the other 2 more?
Yeah. I'm not 45 minutes yet. More thing, but this dispensary site location is really becoming a problem. As Ron pointed out, their local governments are preempted on growing, but on the dispensary site locations, they can either ban it. If they don't ban it, they have to cite them no more restrictive than they would a pharmacy. Right? But you have this huge patchwork of local governments trying to figure out what to do, ordinances, and as you can imagine, it's a competitive business. People are pushing and shoving. Once I got my dispensary, I certainly don't want the city to expand to any more. I think that's something we really, we got to address with the League of Cities and Association of Counties. The last thing, no more 2, just 1. From what we spend a lot of time talking to other states at the national level, and there is a huge, as you can tell, consolidation, merger, internationalization of this business. I want to know how many people here can sing "Oh Canada." Right? Canadian nation. I mean, because the Canadians are really sophisticated, heavily capitalized, and really want to participate in this business in the United States. And so big money is really coming, not the pharmaceuticals, not the Budweisers, it's really coming into this space. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what does that do for the commitment that Robert, patient focus, your interests mean when you have shareholder equity issues, right? I'm going to invest $100 million in a business that hasn't made anything yet. There's a big, put on the TV market. It's going to, I mean, I think those trends are a good sign that people see this as a very viable market, and it's going to get more sophisticated, but it's going to also have impact on our industry, I think. So, don't worry about it.
I would love to have this panel continue to talk for another 2 hours because I think we would be able to occupy the time, but we only have about 10 minutes left. So I'd like to open it up to some questions if I could. I'm not sure we're going to have. Yes, sir, back there. And tell me who you'd like it addressed to if you have a person you want to answer.
Hang on one second. This is more of a legal question. I'm a medical doctor at a cannabis clinic, and I'm also a Vietnam veteran. I went to the VFW to try to see if see if those people be interested in medical marijuana.
Thank you for your service.
And first thing they told me was, well, I got a concealed gun permit.
Great question.
And even I have policemen in practice, and they have concealed gun permit. And none of them are law-breaking people. They're all law-abiding citizens. They defended your rights here, and for your freedom, okay? And they cannot get medical marijuana because they will lose their concealed.
That is such a good question. That's a federal. I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on TV, and so I can answer that question. The federal government, in an attempt to keep firearms out of the mentally ill and challenged, basically said that if you are acknowledging you have a substance abuse issue, you can't get a gun. So by being on a registry, in their eyes, you've acknowledged you have a controlled one substance issue. And so the crazy thing about it is, I understand it, is I can buy 500 guns, and then if I go get my ID card, I can't buy my 501 or 501. I can keep the 500 I have. Now the question in Florida is concealed weapons permit. That's the question that I think is really gray right now, and let's just say the Ag Department doesn't really want to answer it. The question then becomes, a concealed weapons permit is 7 years. It's good for 7 years. But there's a list. So it's easy to cross-reference the list of concealed weapon permit holders with medical marijuana, cannabis ID holders. And the question then becomes, will they either go after them and take them away? I mean, the question is, why should I give up one constitutional right to be able to have another?
And believe it or not, it's the question that we get most commonly in my clinic is about concealed carry, which is crazy.
Well, and it's funny,
Every day, every single day.
I had a gentleman call me who I think voted no on Amendment 2. Had a son who got in some trouble, had a lot of issues. Long story short, he wanted to know how he could possibly get his son to, he's in his 20s. And then the question became, he's on parole. So if a doctor actually makes a constitutionally authorized recommendation, will they test positive for that? And if they do test positive for that, will they go back to jail because they're on probation? And so that's another interesting question. I've heard anecdotally that it's almost a case-by-case scenario where it depends on maybe your probation officer, so then I would love to clarify the concealed weapons permit as well as that.
I think in general what it opens up is what needs to happen as we go forward. It's job protections. It's allowing people in assisted living and nursing homes to utilize cannabis, right? So there's a lot of these freedom of use issues that are going to be coming up that are going to be critical.
Well, and that's the other issue. I tried really hard, and we never got to agreement on that. I knew there was going to be a problem with the facilities. This is federally illegal. It's a Schedule 1. They get reimbursed by Medicaid and Medicare. They're worried about losing all of their reimbursements if they allow a Schedule 1 drug on their property. So even though it clearly authorizes caregivers in hospices to do this for their patients, the entities are saying, not on my property. And then there's the whole question of who administers it, and does it have to be in a lockbox? And I mean, so there's this, in this industry, there's more gray than there's black and white. And so you kind of find yourself weaving in and out of a lot of these questions. But frankly, a lot of it's because it's a Schedule 1 on the federal level.
Hi, my name is Dr. Janet Taylor, and I'm a psychiatrist right here.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, and I recently moved here from New York, but I work for a very large community mental health center here. And two things that are concerning. Just on Friday, got a warning not to even talk about medical cannabis to our patients, and I work with a number of patients who have PTSD who would benefit. So the importance of educating our institutions about how medical cannabis works, especially those who are getting local and community state dollars to fund individuals, which leads to the potential of access to medical cannabis as a healthcare disparity. in the sense of how people who may not qualify for Medicaid, who are underinsured, how do they have access? And I also work in jails and can think about the beneficial treatment and of access to individuals who aren't even considered patients, but inmates with access to medical cannabis. So just want to put that out there about those populations that are already marginalized. How do we make sure that they are part of this communication, of this education in this community as well, because it's so important.
And I know this is a different issue, but I'll give the legislature credit for this as well. What they put in this last bill was a requirement for a diversity plan for each of the MMTCs. So the ones that already had a license in the future have to prove that. The ones that are applying now, it's quite a bit. I think it's 100 points in their overall 1,150 total score. So I'll give the legislature credit for realizing that sometimes people that want to get into this industry got in trouble in the past and they may not be able to. So at least they were able to address inclusion of diversity as a requirement. So again, I give them credit for
But it's
this.
the first thing she said, Ron, that was so terrifying, is that institutions are instructing their clinicians not to even discuss medical cannabis, and it's on my list. That's one thing that the legislature can work on, is to see if we can get hospitals not to be able to restrict.
And that's why Representative Edwards mentioned the article, and I did talk to that reporter, and what I tried to suggest is that unfortunately, kind of the way the system is set up now is docs are either going to do this full time or they're not going to do it at all.
Right.
And that's some of the reasons, is because if my institution comes to me, my hospital comes to me and says, guess what? Make recommendations, but you lose your hospital staff privileges. What am I going to do?
And then there's a panel review board, quite frankly, that has no practicing clinician who's recommending medical cannabis, who's going to be evaluating my practice, quite frankly, that specializes in medical cannabis.
Right.
So I'm going to have about 2 narcotic prescriptions for the year and 20,000 patients in the medical cannabis registry. So I'm hopeful that there's going to be a doctor that understands what I'm doing on the panel review. So I think that's another thing that could be focused on quite legitimately, is making sure that the doctors that are evaluating doctors like me know what I'm doing.
Folks,
That's like Representative Rosen. Go ahead.
Because, I mean, the frustrating part about all of this for us is, where's the Board of Medicine? We're getting yelled at like we're
Here, here.
physicians, and I'm supposed to know, the rules and regulations for being a physician. I'm a lawyer. I don't tell you what to do advice.
I've reached out to them and they've never called
They're
me back.
useless. They're absolutely useless. And here's the reason why. You're going to have a governor promoting $50 million for medically assisted addiction treatment. What does that mean? It means money for methadone providers.
My doors are open to
You
every single.
absolutely. But I would go back to your institutions. I'm from Broward County. I have, unfortunately, one of the most crooked and corrupt hospital districts, publicly funded. I'm going to say, follow the money trail and the influence of the private board members and directors, and who's directing them on what they can then tell you to talk about. And I think it's ridiculous. We're talking about methadone. Clinics are largely not regulated, and we're going to be forcing physicians and incentivizing them to not be able to talk about this. They should be pushing more drugs and further exacerbate a problem in a different limelight. So that's another cause to take up for next session.
We're getting close. We've got 4 minutes, and I see like 20 hands up, and there's no way we're going to get through this. We got time for 2 quick ones. Moderator, choose.
That wasn't in the job description. So right there.
Me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm Zoe, I work at True Leave. I just had a comment with the whole patient not getting their cards thing. I used to work in the dispensary in St. Pete. I just want to say it's extremely frustrating for me to tell a patient that they cannot purchase their product because it took them so long to get their card. Now that they finally have it, their script has expired. And it sucks for me to say,
It's
you
improving.
can't get it. And
It's improving, and realize though, because and again, I don't want to defend the department, but because the department knew how long the cards were taking, we actually worked out a deal where once you get your email that you've been approved, you can actually purchase. So there is a great lag between getting approval from the department and actually getting the card in the mail. But no, once you get that email, the patient is allowed to purchase from that
right,
point
and I
forward.
think that's one of the problems too, is not a lot of patients know that once they get that email, they can come purchase.
Fair enough.
I think they say, or I think they think that, oh, I have to wait for my card before I
Well,
can
that's
come.
because the clinical facility hasn't instructed the
Right.
patient, quite frankly,
Right,
appropriately.
and that's one of our jobs now, is I tell them, yeah, you can actually come in when you get the email, and they're like, oh, that's so helpful, thank you
Yeah,
for letting me know.
that's definitely on the dock.
I just wrote an article all about that, so I'll give you.
Right back there, I
Yes,
guess
we'll
it's the
talk.
last.
All right, Bob.
Bob Riley, High Life Magazine, High Life Media. This is for the legislature. A lot of Floridians want to know why the regular session was adjourned without addressing medical cannabis, and why it cost taxpayers $600,000 to be able to come back to special session to be able to take care of something that was a constitutional crisis.
I think I addressed that. I think I told you the reasons why the bill ended up dying. And the good news is they came back within a couple of months that they had to come back anyhow, and they actually passed the bill. They had to come back for the budget. So, you know, there were other issues that required them to come back for a special session. And I look at it this way. They came back and they did something. We could still be waiting all the way around to 18 before they had actually passed an implementing bill. So for what it's worth, they did their job.
All right, let's do this. Dana, I know you got a quick announcement. I think I've got a lesson learned here. I need to make this like a 3-hour panel next year. Dana.
Yeah, we've just got a few different changes for lunch today. If you will go head towards the lower lobby where the elevators are, the buffet is going to be set up there. Like I said, we're a little bit full for lunch today. So there'll be 2 different places that you can eat, actually 3. You can either eat in the boathouse, which is the big building with the blue roof, and you can also eat in the Palms, which is right outside this main entrance here in the grass area. Or if you want, you can take your lunch up to your room, whatever you'd like to do. But we'd like to make sure you pull your tickets out so we can move you through as quickly as possible and get everyone fed at this time.
And lastly, this is for me, because and when we come back from lunch, we're in concurrent sessions. So I need to see a show of hands. I know you asked this earlier, Dana, but I need to see it because we've got more people coming through. How many people are going into the medical session tracks? Okay, so we are going to make some room changes. We have got an air wall right here. And so this air wall is going to be pulled. Medical session track's going to be over here. Industry track's going to be over here. Okay? Don't go by what's on your program because I'm flip-flopping. All right? All right. Thank you.
Big round of applause for our panel, please.